Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Spellberg. I am president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation of Santa Barbara, California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to Speech and Spirit. This is the first in a series of collaborations that we hope will extend many years into the future. The idea behind them is to think about a newly spiritual politics, a politics that is more than human, more than contemporary, more than just historical. We are living in a time when our politics and our practices have made it nearly impossible to think through the true consequences of our way of life, and nearly impossible to change any aspect of that way of life. The hypothesis we'll be testing tonight is whether spiritual commitments, old ideas like spirit possession, visitations from ghosts, communication with ancestors, treating the world as consciously alive, can offer us a new kind of agency amid the planetary emergencies that we face. What does it mean to treat a tradition as literally alive, reincarnated in you or in your children, as responsive to the world, as inhabiting landscapes or buildings or other living beings? What techniques can we develop in an overwhelmingly secular age to enlarge the circumference of our sensitivity and curb the radius of our actions? Humans possess the tools of our own destruction. Even if we could dismantle those tools, we'll never be rid of the capacity to make and deploy them. So then the question becomes one of discipline. Can we train ourselves to lay those tools down and keep them in the shed? Can we train ourselves to satisfy our desires and our curiosity, our need to mitigate risk and yet fill life to the brim, without the double-edged power of an ideology that's totally blind to the limits of the planet's resources? Speech and Spirit is a laboratory for the development of such techniques. Techniques, you might say, for feeling more and, at least in some sense, doing less. One source for such techniques is religion, sometimes beautiful, sometimes severe and limiting. Yet other sources at the heart of tonight's experiment are poetry and music. Yet another source, close to the heart of all three of these, is the free play and imaginative profligacy of childhood. One of my favorite games as a child was to pretend that I was a shepherd caring for my flock. There was a little hill behind my house, and a small cut between two trees leading from the middle of the hill up to the top. This little groove, not more than 15 feet long, was dilated in my imagination into a mountain pass, and I had to lead my sheep up and down with the seasons, to the top of the hill in summer, to the bottom of the hill in winter. Over the course of an afternoon, I would mark the passage of the year 4 or 5 times: summer, winter, summer, winter. An early snowstorm might catch me on the way down, or a wolf might be prowling in the alpine heights. But mostly the game was uneventful: up the hill, down the hill, with some time to let the sheep stretch out over the summer grass, or huddle together in the winter paddocks while I pretended to eat a stew. It was a rehearsal of pleasure in work, of a life undisturbed by the forward lurch of time. It was a life held in place by the round of the year, a year enclosed admittedly by an afternoon, like the yolk by its shell. This was a game inspired by many sources: the images of shepherds watching their flocks by night during the Christmas vigil, stories I had heard from my nanny about her childhood in the mountains of southern Poland, picture books showing ancient forms of labor. But they became something corporeal in my little running to and fro up that little hill. It may be bare saying that I'm obviously not a shepherd, and really never have been. I don't know anything, actually, about shepherding. But to be this person, even as a child, even in this perfunctory and pretend way, was an investigation into a form of life, an ethics, a set of obligations to other beings and to the land beneath my feet. It was an experiment in considering an existence, a form of life. Of course, I didn't think of it that way at the time. I thought of it only as pleasure. The pleasure of being someone else, of stretching out my being. I don't think I even thought about it as using my imagination. I thought about it, insofar as I thought about it at all, as extending the reach of my existence. This is something where the child has to instruct the man. I think back on this experience across a great gulf. It's not quite mine anymore, though I wish it might be mine again. The joy, the sense of transcendence experienced in such moments as this has, it seemed to me, and it seems to me now, an untapped political potential. But for this kind of spirit possession to have an ethical charge, there's 2 tricks to doing it right. First, you have to choose the right person to stand up for and the right person to live as. And second, you have to do it without humility and with humility and without dogmatism. What gives strength and purpose is a conviction founded in embodiment, in habit and ritual, rather than in dogmatism. You take up a cause, a way of life, because you become a certain kind of person, not because you surrender to an ideology. It is a way of surrendering to a vision while still remaining fully human, instead of reducing yourself to an arid or an intolerant abstraction. What you all will see tonight is a vision that is flexible, fluid, fully anchored in the human, and yet no less resilient and ferocious for that. What you'll see is a collaboration between two great artists, Joshua Bennett and Samora Pinderhughes. Joshua Bennett is a poet, critic, performer, and teacher. He's a professor at Dartmouth College, winner of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Whiting Award, the author of two mightily acclaimed books of poetry, The Sobbing School and Ode, as well as a work of literary criticism, having been property once myself, that explores Black literature's intimate partnership with the lives of animals. Matching him toe-to-toe, Samora Pinderhughes is a keyboardist and musical artist of rare versatility, straddling jazz, hip-hop, the traditional music of the Caribbean, and a deep array of other sources. He's equal parts aesthete and activist, having fought on the vivid boundary between art and politics for practically his entire life. He's collaborated with numerous artists, among them Herbie Hancock and Milo X and Christian Scott. He was the first ever Soros Art for Justice Fellow, and he's the creator of the Multidisciplinary Healing Project. Joshua and Samora will perform now from their ongoing collaboration, and then they've graciously agreed to talk a little bit about their work with me and also to take a few questions from those of you watching online. We're so grateful that you're with us today, and we're so grateful, Joshua and Samora, that you're with us today too. So thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, brother, for that beautiful introduction. My name is Joshua Bennett. It's an honor to be here, not only with two of my best friends in the world, but two of the writers and thinkers I most admire. So Samora and I are going to jam out for a bit from our newest project. This first poem's entitled, The Next Black National Anthem.
Hold 1 second. Sorry. The Zoom is reconnected. It says. Sorry.
You're fine. It's not bad to take a breath. Fire. There's two tricks. The other pacing. Oh wait, are we on there? Okay. The next Black National Anthem will naturally begin with a blues note. Some well-adorned, love-lorn lyric about how your baby left and all you got in the divorce was remorse and a mortgage, and a somewhat morbid, though mostly metaphorical obsession with the underground, with how it feels to live in such unrelenting emptiness, unseen, altogether uncorrectable by the state's endless arms. Just imagine. Ellison's prologue set to the most elaborate Metro Boomin instrumental you can fathom. Brass horns and pulsar cannons firing in tandem as Aretha lines a hymn in the footnotes. 12.5 minutes of unchecked, bass-laden braggadocio. An ode to the unwanted, the most imitated, incarcerated human beings in the history of the world, and every nanosecond of the band's boundless song belongs to us. It is ours. The way the word overcome, or the Wiz, or Herman Melville is ours. In every corner store and court of law, any barbershop argument or hours-long spat over spades, the next Black National Anthem will, by the rule, begin in blood and span our centuries-long war against oblivion, elaborate the anguish at the core of our gentleness, how even that generosity is a kind of weapon. This music, a bladed criticism of a country obsessed with owning everything that shimmers or moves with a destination in mind, even the sky, even the darkness behind our eyes when we dream. This next piece is the beginning of a much larger sequence, reparation. which is about how we might all be made whole. Reparation. 40 acres and a jewel-encrusted orchid crown for each and every living baby girl growing up the way we did, the way we do, unbridled, unburied though we stay pursued by the U.S. school to prison state's laser-like vision, bi-weekly standing ovations, bras coupe resuscitated with a sledgehammer slung over his left shoulder, eyes ablaze and dead set on the private sector, the price of 4-year tuition, 4-year fascist presidents, any and all forms of predatory opulence. Scholarships. Scholars that love us enough to break this language lengthwise, filled as it is with the bones of our fallen, monuments to the fallen, a gravesite for the illustrious Negro dead, like Zora Neale Hurston said. Illustrious meaning you are black and full of adoration, or vexed, which is just another way of saying you wanted to survive. The world said die, and you refused its refusal. Another approach to the general sentiment that blackness is beautiful, with no referent to their everyday negation of our essential human splendor, an apology on the Senate floor for the trade, the plunder of our names, unremarked graves, a hand in the hair, a boot to the throat, guns in the schools and the guns are the books, the state of the second grade teacher calling your son a distraction, your daughter's braids illegal, you're building a blight on the neighborhood, the good you do and dream of, never quite good enough to merit the bullseye's removal. A ship to wherever we point on a map of the measurable universe. Dare call harbor, sanctum, ground where the children can play and come home whole.
Came upon a man who carried in his hands all of his years at the factory plant, through minimum wage and many a stage of dreams and love and sorrow. He asked if I could spare a pair of my walking shoes to help him climb the hills that still lay in his life. Something he could wear to carry his cares, hold up his iron will, a day maybe tomorrow. He wanted to lay down, he wanted to test the crown. I placed myself at his feet and said, whatever you need. He said, practice what you preach. Yes, I will hold that weight. I'll hold that weight for you. Yes, I will hold that weight. I'll hold that weight for you. Came upon a man who carried in his fist all of the violence that happened to him. Through many a day, he locked it away and hardened his flesh like no weapon could prosper. They put him in a cage and said it was his fate to ride with the rest, but he got out in 8. He puts on a mask now to cover his rage, 'cause red and blue lights might look twice and bring the chopper today. He wanted to break down. He wanted to test the ground. I said, how do we defeat that state that do evil deeds? He said, practice what you preach. I said, how do we defeat that state that do evil deeds? He said, practice what you preach. Yes, I will hold that weight. I'll hold that weight for you. Yes, I will hold that weight. I'll hold that weight for you. Yes, I will hold that weight. I'll hold that weight for you. Yes, I will hold that weight. I don't know if it holds to. I had daydreams, ways of freedom, what it might be. Lately, I see working ways out.
It was beautiful, brother. All right. This is for the barbers out there who might be watching, and anyone who's ever known or loved a barber. Shout out to mine, Fryon. He hooked me up for today. Shout out to Dex as well.
Hey.
And BK. Barber song. Postmodern blackness, blacksmith. Straight razor reshaping self-esteem. You dream in geometries unreachable by any other means. Speak in entire phrases abandon standard American etymology, hence. You liberate waves from the sea, cornrows from the cornfield. Reclaim fade, so I now hear the word and imagine only abundance. Caesar never meant anything to me, but a cut so close you could see the shimmer of a man's thinking. You are how we first learned to bend language built to unmake us. Accept implausible risk. Some much older man, shaver in hand like a baton full of wasp gossip, asking, with the grain or against. And the question feels damn near existential, given this is the only place we can live, in such thoughtless proximity to another person's open hands, be held by the face, ask outright to be made glamorous, shaped by your polymathic brilliance. You bi-weekly psychoanalyst, first stop before funeral, before wedding and block party alike. You soothsayer, cooing children to calm as they sit in the chair for the first time, as still a storm as one might reasonably expect. You ethicist, defending hairlines at all cost, your vigilance keeping online and otherwise slander at bay. Philosopher king, thesaurus in the drawer, dominoes and scotch and barbasol adorning your countertop, right above the chorus line of clippers swaying to the clamor of checkmates and offhand insults now filling the shop. Each moving as if the unfettered locks of some great metal monster, some faraway watcher, and you, guardian of it all, clean as a pope. So for this next one, we're going to go a bit off script into a poem that means a lot to me these days, as it recalls when I last lived in New York City. You good, brother? You good? It's no stress. Just give me 1 second. This is benediction. Benediction. God bless the lightning bolt in my little brother's hair. God bless our neighborhood barber, the patience it takes to make a man you've just met beautiful. God bless every beautiful thing called monstrous since the dawn of a colonizer's time. God bless the arms of the mother on the crosstown bus, the sterling silver cross at the crux of her collarbone, its shine barely visible beneath her nightshade navy New York Yankees hoodie. God bless the baby boy kept precious in her embrace, his wail turning my entire row into an opera house. God bless the vulnerable ones, how they call us toward love and its infinite unthinkable cost. God bless the floss, the flash, the brash and bare-knuckle brawl of the South Bronx girls who raised my mother to grease knuckles, cut eyes, get fly as any fugitive dream on the lam, on the run from the law, as any and all of us are who dare to wake and walk in this skin. And you best believe God bless this skin, the shimmer and slick of it, the wherewithal to bear the rage of sisters, brothers slain and still function each morning, still sit at a desk, send an email, take an order, dream a world, some heaven big enough for black life to flourish, to grow. God bless the no. My story is not for sale. The no, this body belongs to me and the earth alone. The sea, the thing about souls is that they by definition cannot be owned. God bless the beloved flesh this refusal calls home. God bless the unkillable interior, bless the uprising, bless the rebellion, bless the overflow. God bless everything that survives the fire.
Young man, come down from that tower. It isn't yet your time. I'll tell you 5 years later, you made it out alive. Blame game's gon' lead to that pill. For real, it's such a thrill. You might get lost in the darkness. I'm sensing so much anger. Where do you put it all? You made best friends with danger. It lives inside your walls. Someone's catching it tonight. You lose your pride. You let it rain down on them. Show you're heartless. 'Cause you're a man. It's what you do, and it don't matter what you've been through. Yeah, you're a weapon, yeah, you're a gun. You ain't no father, you ain't no son. You might be canvas, you might be paint. Just hide that damage and fade away. Play the record and lose control. On the count of 3, am I gonna hurt somebody? If I feel these things, is it gonna hurt me? On the count of 3, I can feel my heart is running. If I let it sing a sting, will it just erase me? Masculinity. fall. Don't let me fall. Don't let me fall. Don't let me fall.
This next poem is for my son, August Galileo, who's probably asleep right now. Yeah, it's bedtime. So charge up, little man. This is for you. Dad poem in 2 parts. 1. Months into the plague now. I am disallowed entry even into the waiting room with Mom. Escorted outside instead by men armed only with guns and bottles of hand sanitizer, their entire countenance, its own American metaphor. So the first time I see you in full force, I am pacing maniacally up and down the block outside, FaceTiming the radiologist and your mother too, her arm angled like a cellist to help me see. We are dazzled by the sight of each bone in your feet, the pulsing black archipelago of your heart, your fists in front of your face like mine when I was only just born, 10 times as big as you are now. Your great-grandmother calls me Tyson the moment she sees this pose, prefigures a boy built for conflict, her barbarous and metal little man. She leaves the world only months after we learn you are entering into it. And her mind the year before that. In the dementia's final days, she envisions herself as a girl of 17, running through fields of strawberries, unfettered as a kingfisher. I watch her stance and imagine her laughter echoing back across the ages. You, her youngest descendant born into freedom, our littlest burden lifter, world beater, avant-garde percussionist, swinging darkness into song. 2. A boy, I am told. The familiar numbers fall like a wall of ash across my mind, the future now made both freshly opaque and terrifying in its clarity. I know what I have survived. I have lived to tell of it only in songs I can belt without ending the world. But enough of the untold terrors we know. There is an entire genre of poems about the fear of bringing another black sun onto the earth. I refuse them all. Little one, they are not ours to bear. There is a war outside, yes, and inside our home there are books about flowers, 10-speed bicycles, dinosaurs with names you can't even pronounce yet. We are building a story for you that is bigger than bombs or the words of assassins who do not love us. Your inheritance is this refusal and infinitely more. Triceratopses, hyacinth, racing uphill in our blue helmets, 2 runaway ice comets cracking the night air open. So swift within its shadow, we are almost invisible.
This song is entitled Process. There's some things that I don't want, so I try not to think about it. So there's a lot of ugly things in my heart. I just hope to the Lord I don't slip. Feel me. There's some things that I don't want in it, so I try not to think about it. There's a lot of ugly things in my heart. I just hope to the Lord I don't slip. I wonder what it's like to let it out, that part of me that I'm so afraid of. It holds on me and tosses me about. Doesn't seem to be something I get away from. Tell me, how do you name those well-kept secrets that you never say out loud? And why does the body see these demons keep me from calling out? I guess I'll just say it's a process, one day at a time. There have been weeks when I already lost it, but I came back every time. So there's a whole entire world that I've created in my mind, and it's so much more real than the one I see outside. I've populated it with people who can see that I'm no good, and who know all the best places where I can go to hide. And I'm haunted by the ghost of my best friend who just left me to head to the next world. But I'd like to believe it's the West End with a room full of art and his best girl. And it's positive that I could feel him, but I don't know if I took advantage of those times he was right in that next room, 'cause my pain was such I couldn't stand it. Tell me, how do you name those well-kept secrets that you never say out loud? And why does the body see these demons but keep me from calling out? I guess I'll just say it's a process. Guess I'll just say it's a process. I guess I'll just say it's a process, one day at a time. There have been weeks when I already lost it, but I came back every time. I guess I'll just say it's a process. I guess I'll just say it's a process. I guess I'll just say it's a process, one day at a time. There have been weeks when I already lost it. I guess I'll just say it's a process. I guess I'll just say it's a process, one day at a time. There have been weeks when I already lost it, but I came back every time. Yes, I came back every time.
This last selection is from my father, who's literature now. It's on the cover of my last book of poems. Got to talk to him today. One quick note, too, on process, actually. All of these original compositions from Samora were created after hearing the recordings of these poems. And just so thankful to him at every step of the process. My brother's been willing to go on a real adventure with me to make this thing, so thank you. All right, for my dad, what else should I say before this? He integrated his high school, so it's a true story. And I spoke to him this morning on the phone. His birthday's in 3 weeks. This is for you, Pop. America will be after Langston Hughes. I am now at the age where my father calls me brother when we say goodbye. Take care of yourself, brother. He whispers a half beat before we hang up the phone, and it's as if some great bridge has unfolded over the air between us. He is 71 years old. He was born in the throat of Jim Crow, Alabama, one of 10 children, their bodies side by side in the kitchen each morning, like a pair of hands exalting. Over breakfast, I asked him to tell me the hardest thing about going to school back then, expecting some history I have already memorized. Boycotts and attack dogs, fire hoses, Bull Connor in his personal tank, candy paint shining white as a Confederate ghost. He says, honestly, probably having to read the Canterbury Tales. He says, eating lunch alone. Now, I hear the word America and think first of my father's loneliness, of the hands holding the pens that stabbed him as he walked through the hallway, unclenched palms settling onto a wooden desk, taking notes, trying to pretend the shame didn't feel like an inheritance. You say democracy. And I see the men holding documents that sent him off to war a year later, Motown blaring from a country boy's bunker as napalm scarred the sky into jigsaw patterns, his eyes open wide as the blooming blue heart of the light bulb in a Crown Heights basement where he and my mother will dance for the first time, their bodies swaying like rockets in the impossible dark. And yes, I know that this is more than likely not what you mean when you sing liberty, but it is the only kind I know or can readily claim, the times where those hunted by history are underground and somehow still daring to love what they cannot hold or fully fathom, when a stranger is not a threat but the promise of a different ending. I woke up this morning and there were men on television lauding a wall big enough to box out an entire world, families torn with the stroke of a pen, citizenship little more than some garment that can be stolen or reduced to cinder at a tyrant's whim. My father knows this, grew up knowing this, witnessed firsthand the firebombs, the Klan, multiple messiahs, love soaked and shot through, somehow still believes in this grand, blood-stained experiment, still votes, still prays that his children might make a life unlike any he has ever seen. He looks at me like the promise of another cosmos, and I never know what to tell him. All of the books in my head have made me cynical and distant, but there's a choir in him that calls me forward. My disbelief, built as it is from the bricks of his belief, not in any America you might see on network news or hear heralded before the start of a football game, but in the quiet power of Sam Cooke singing that he was born by a river that remains unnamed, that he runs alongside to this day, some vast and future country, some nation within a nation, black as candor, loud as the sound of my father's unfettered laughter over cheese eggs and coffee, his eyes shut tight as armories, his fists finally unclenched as if he were invincible.
Gentlemen, I'm just astonished. I'm just floored. That was an amazing, amazing performance. Thank you both for it. Thank you so much. It touches me in the deep heart's core, as Yeats would say. I want to just take a moment to register my incredible, incredible appreciation for that performance. Just beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. It's now my unenviable task to try to follow that with some talk, but what I'm going to try to do is just say something about what I was hearing and ask you both to talk a little bit about it, and also to invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A on our Zoom webinar if you'd like to ask something of our artists and join this conversation. So please do that. I want to ask about a whole bunch of different things, not least how your collaboration began and how the work proceeds. But before I do that, I want to jump into like the meat of it. I really want to ask you some questions about the meaning and political charge and spiritual and aesthetic charge of the kind of work that you're doing. And I was thinking, Joshua, about this line from the first poem you read, we are the most imitated and incarcerated people in the world. And you follow up with this idea about Melville is ours too. And I guess I want to ask you, what is the relationship to tradition for an artist like you working right now in this moment where every question of tradition is very charged? It's really charged. People are anxious about losing traditions. People are anxious about other people taking their traditions. People are anxious about what it might mean to earn the right to belong to a tradition. So what does that mean to be in a tradition most imitated and also most incarcerated?
I know Samora gonna have some heat on this. Just to start, first, thank you, Matthew, for entering into conversation with me many months ago now, and for the courage and imagination it took to help us bring this to life. What does it mean? I'm steeped in tradition. It's what I know. It's what brought me to poetry, not just walking past my sister's bedroom door every day where she had Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman taped to the front, but learning to love poetics as such by seeing Baptist and Pentecostal preachers preach every Sunday and seeing people cartwheel down the aisles or burst into tears, or hearing my mother say that something the preacher said was her word for the week, and that it was a kind of armor she could carry around with her every day. I took that very seriously, and I knew as a writer I wanted other people to have their words for the week, for the month, or for a lifetime. That's what brought me to teaching. And my first students were incarcerated at PICC in Riverside, 2 institutions in Philadelphia. I was an undergraduate, and I started a program called the Prison Poetry Initiative, where we brought spoken word poets from West Philly into the prisons, and we taught creative writing workshops on weekends. And that was long before I knew that, people like Gwendolyn Brooks were also committed to a certain kind of practice of breaking down at least the literary barrier between the inside and outside. She wrote a brilliant, beautiful introduction to Etheridge Knight's book, Poems from Prison. She also introduced him at a Library of Congress reading he gave with Donald Hall. And whenever I return to those words, I think about perhaps the most important literary responsibility of a contemporary poet, I think, is to be an abolitionist, to try to dismantle the present prison system as it exists through whatever instruments we have available to us. One of the primary ones for me is the written page, right? So I've done my best to collaborate with poets on the inside. And to think about that in an abolitionist tradition specifically has been liberatory for me, right? To say this isn't just sort of a one-off, I'm working on a particular book with someone, but to say, I'm part of a people for whom accumulated freedom struggle is a shining center point of our lives. It's part of what we're doing when we teach our children who Benjamin Banneker and Harriet Tubman were, and it's part of what we're doing when we show up to read poems. It's always a social affair, it's always political, and it's always about the pursuit of human freedom.
Something that you and I share is a long-time commitment to working in prisons, and I would say that my experience there resonates with some of the very beautiful remarks you've just made, in that it also was there that I learned the incredible importance of people feeling like they belong to a train of thought, a train of ideas, a train of fellowship that extended beyond the prison walls. It was like a kind of life raft that had come from the outside, or was like a kind of rope ladder that had been dropped down that people could climb up. And you couldn't just say to people there, oh, just do whatever you want, make it new. No, you had to really, or what people were one of the things people were hungry for was, where do I fit into, a parade of ancestors, a parade of people I can follow in the footsteps of, who I can have walking beside me, even as I'm just walking around the yard over and over and over again. Samora, did you want to throw anything into this particular conversation about tradition and politics?
Sure. I mean, I have like a lot of random, unconnected notes. One of which is just when I think about the question that you asked about. Well, you brought up this idea of like, certain people belonging to certain traditions and traditions being co-opted, different things like that. And I think, when I hear the word traditions, I think that not all traditions are positive. There are traditions of domination,
Yes.
So I think many people, like, they see aesthetics and genre and things like that as disconnected from daily life, disconnected from, like, embodied practice, as you were mentioning, disconnected from politics. I mean, and that just is not the case.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times when people believe they're entering into a musical tradition or artistic tradition or whatever it is, they're actually entering into a tradition of domination because they're not involved with the rest of what they think they're a part of. Because the tradition that I aim to, or that I feel, and I was lucky enough to, I think, also be born into, as Joshua was talking about, it's not just a tradition of music, it's a tradition of living. It's ways of being, it's ways of relating to one another, it's ways of loving on one another, and expressing the complexities of life in context with one another. And I think everybody comes from one of those traditions in different ways, but many people choose to leave those traditions to embody and like practice traditions of domination. I think that's what colonialism has brought us. And so I think people just fall into that all the time when they are either unaware or uninterested in like that part of the stuff. And I think that goes back to this thing of when you don't have skin in the game, so to speak, it's very easy for you to be just like, oh, I'm here, I'm da-da-da-da-da. And, for me at base level, what it's always about is just like being there for people.
Yes.
And people being there for you.
Yeah.
And that seems very simple, but I don't know, people don't practice it a lot.
That's such a profound point, Samora, and it makes me think, like, this is part of the reason why we have traditions, because in fact being there for other people and having them be there for you is very hard. Is in fact, like, we should acknowledge that it's in fact an extremely difficult thing to do, and that's why you step into a cultural structure that's got a set of rules and norms to tell you how to do that. And the other thing that, so that you can't, in a way, we also, at the same time that we need to encourage people to be good to one another, we also shouldn't pretend that it's easier than it actually is, right? We should actually...
It takes a lot of work.
Right. And it takes 10,000 years, in a way, of accumulated knowledge in order to do it right. And the other thing that occurred to me in hearing you just talking now, this idea of traditions of domination versus traditions of, let's call them, liberation, that seems to suggest to me that the other issue, and something maybe that we get really confused about in the present discourse, is that by and large people are gonna make use of a tradition, or they're gonna walk into one. And so you can't just say, like, it's not enough to say, give up your tradition of domination, like, give up your colonialism, give up your white supremacy, whatever it is, because or to kind of just critique a tradition out of existence or something, because people are going to be looking, always for some system to walk into. And so I think those of us who are particularly concerned with art and culture, we got to be sensitive to the fact that people need to be offered choices, and we need to argue for the ones that are the right ones.
Not to go back into it, but I totally agree, and I think that's what's so exciting about abolition that a lot of people miss, is that it's not just a tradition of taking things away. It's a tradition of imagining so many different new things into being.
Yeah.
And it's a context in which when we rethink, when we take away punishment and we think about care, then we get to the stuff that every single person in the world needs, like and it's more present than ever. I mean, we're losing people every day.
Yeah.
We lost Greg Tate today. Like, yes, Ashe, like, that's one of the most important writers in the world. So, we're, like, everyone is experiencing those things, and certain people are experiencing them more often than others as a result of our structures. But these are actually processes that every single one of us needs and have been robbed of as a result of the structures we have to live inside of. So abolition is, like, actually the way into all of that.
Do you want to say something about this, Joshua? Because that's an amazing, deep point that we should stick with for a second.
Yeah, it's beautifully put. That I don't think abolition necessarily begins with demolition, but with care practices, right? It's actually in many ways about saying that when we talk about a critique of the carceral state, maybe the place to begin is to say, well, what do people need? What is missing? What do we need police and prisons to do in order to meet a kind of lack? And what sort of affirmative vision can take that place, as opposed to one that's monitoring people every day, that's rooted in discipline, punishment, control, whether it be psychic, social, or civic, right? And I love that idea. That's what someone like Ruthie Gilmore is putting forward, right? Mariam Kaba, Derricka Purnell, and George Jackson, I would say too, right? Like that's a certain kind of affirmative, powerful vision of what it means to live an abundant life, a robust human life, and to say that maybe not even all just human forms of life on earth, also non-human forms of life deserve to flourish. And any abolitionist vision worth its salt is that capacious. It's ecologically minded, it's spiritually minded, and it's focused on how we can get to another world, and are building one already.
Something we talk about a lot at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, something we're really committed to, is an idea that Gandhi articulated as the constructive program. He was always saying that you can't imagine that liberating India from British occupation through nonviolent resistance is somehow the end of the line, that the project has to be to build another India that people can actually be drawn to and live in, and otherwise you'll just, you'll get rid of the British, but you'll have the same structure in place unless you do that. And so this idea of a constructive program being the thing behind abolition, being the thing behind the work of justice, I think is enormously important. And when you talk about George Jackson, incarcerated in the 60s, reading Nietzsche, it also makes me think about how so much of this work has to be about will, right? And about directing the will. And I think maybe it's a mistake to imagine that even nonviolent structures of resistance are without will, are somehow passive, right? Like there has to be a kind of cultivation of a really specific kind of will. And it seems to me that it's a dangerous thing to do, right? Because the will can easily get out of control. The will can go in the wrong direction. The will can become immediately the will to dominate. And so how you, maybe this is a question for you both, as activists and artists, which are both identities that require an enormous channeling of the will and a disciplining of the will. How do we think about will without domination?
That's a great question. I don't know that I think of myself as an activist, but now that I've gotten this question twice in a week and a half, I might need to step back for a second.
It's a tricky word. I get worried.
I don't think it's a bad word,
too,
though.
But
I really do think you're on to something. In no small part because our mutual colleague Jesse pushed me on it, and he said, "Well, what is the teaching doing then, at its best? Is that has nothing to do with activism? You don't think?" And then I had to sit again for several minutes. Say, all right, I'm going to sit with that for a second. What do I actually think I'm doing when I'm teaching in a prison, or I'm teaching sonnets to 7-year-old children in Harlem or something, and I'm talking to them about who Benjamin Banneker was? What do I think I'm actually up to? And if what I think I'm up to is I'm trying to give them a more capacious vision for who they can be, in no small part because of who their ancestors were, there's something political about that I can't get away from as much as I would like to, right? And I think this question about will is a complicated one. I think it's like any affect in the sense that love can be poisonous, if it's not done with moderation and in a caring community, right, and with much thought. And so part of how I try to think about will as something we moderate in community. It's something that needs to be adjudicated, like prophecy. You know, what do you do with prophecy? You weigh it. You bring it to others to see if they can see the other parts of that vision. So as someone who was quite a willful child, I needed a community of people to help me figure out how to channel that energy in a way that wasn't just fighting people in the street, you know. I needed I found out I wasn't a singer like my big sister. So they said, maybe it's poems, maybe it's plays, you know, maybe it's fiction, maybe it's running. And for a while it was all those things. And then it was also paleontology. You know, I fell in love with Triceratops, who made an appearance right, in the poem. So I think it's something that we work on together. We're always honing, sharpening one another. And that's a practice of care too.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. So many things. But I think, there's a few words that come to mind for me specifically when thinking about the question of will and, like, you know, domination, these ideas. One is community, which he just said, and how, you know, he just spoke to in the greatest way. And with that, I think also comes organization. Like, I think that one of the great charges of this moment is organizing. And there's some amazing organizing going on, but it's being like subsumed under cults of celebrity and things like that we have to get away from. So I think that's a big one. I think grace is a big one. I think that's another word that just like comes to me a lot these days. And there's that's a practice too that is just like extending to others and to oneself the reality that one is complicated. Like for me, that's what a lot of my songs are about, is just that I hold a lot of things that not all of which are necessarily good. And I think a lot of times actually in like a ironic, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but in a cruel twist, like it actually we actually like create the more space for I believe we create more space for like people to do and do things that are really terrible by pretending that all of us never have the capacity to be bad, you know, and to be all things at the same time. We create a very binary idea where one is only one thing forever, and one is like there are bad people and there are good people, and in reality we are all things at the same time, you know, and different things activate us and a lot of times there's just no space for that. There's no grace for process and things like that. I'm not saying obviously that people should not be held accountable. That's very different. But what I mean is that we oftentimes, like the people that do the worst things, their whole thing is that they're like God's gift to humanity. You know what I mean? So like that thing seems to be something very important to break down in order for actually to get to a place where people can like figure out together how to be kind.
Waiting for grace, in other words, is a kind of call for humility. Is maybe one way to think about that. That if you really are thinking about grace as that sometimes the good in you is awoken, and it's not really thanks to you. I mean, it's just something you got that just. The good might be in there, but it requires something like grace, or indeed grace itself, in order to actually come out of you. And if you're thinking in that way, then you're no longer feeling a kind of protective, defensive ownership over what you judge to be good about yourself. Is that kind of
100%? I mean, you were saying it in your introduction. You know, you talked about humility, and you talked about that story, and it really, I just was like so taken by that because. Number one, I think that that's a huge key to this moment, humility. You know, everybody, like, again, all the worst people think that they're saving, like, or I don't know if they think they're saving the world, but they say that they're saving the world. You know what I mean? That's how they present themselves as that, you know?
Yeah.
And it also just makes me think that one of the things that makes me really sad about this moment that I struggle with even personally is that nobody wants to just be regular. You know what I mean? And when you talked about that story of the shepherd, like, yo, that's the joint. Like, that's amazing, you know? And I even have to battle that because the value system is placed to, like, be special and be the one and be the thing and be the originator. And going back to tradition, I really want to get to a place where I'm totally happy and content just being regular and just being a part of a tradition and just being present.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
I don't have to be the most important person in the world.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. You know, Samora, it makes me want to ask now like a really hard and sensitive question, which is namely that, you know, the world right now, and maybe particularly people on the left, are just so caught up in a kind of self-righteousness where there's an incredible defensiveness about, you know, protecting one's identity, protecting, you know, what one claims as a tradition, and sometimes even to talk about it can be taboo. And, you know, I want to just throw out there a kind of open-ended question, like how do we reconcile that with we know, I think almost all of us know in our sort of better hearts that the path toward grace or path towards something like that is goes in the direction of humility, goes in the direction of that, like the rhythm of normal life, the rhythm of the philosopher king in the barbershop, you know, amazing image also of like someone who is just working the craft, you know, and creates a world that way.
Well, it's tough, right? Because humility has a certain proximity to humiliation, etymologically. And so I think one way we do it, we have to celebrate risk and a certain relationship to risk, the risk of being humiliated, the risk of loss. Part of what I'm also describing in that barber song poem is that part of the beauty of the tenderness is that you hold your neck up and someone puts a blade to it, right? And it's the practice of doing that every week, that kind of trust in a stranger every single time, while also asking them to make you beautiful and asking them to know how. And they say, well, how would you like to look? And there are 40 options on the board. You know, there's that haircut sort of map. And I don't know how much that can be reproduced culturally, but part of how I try to pursue that aim in classrooms, at least, is just to say it. You know, to say you have to forgive one another and you have to be merciful to one another, which is slightly different. You have to give one another grace.
Forgiveness in advance.
Yes, that you don't deserve. You cannot earn it. You cannot earn mercy, right? That is what we must give to one another every day, in no small part because neither the good nor the bad in me is readily evident to me. Do you know? Like, I think becoming a father shows me this every day. I'll see my son just act things out, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like that, you know? And some of it, I'm like, oh, well, that actually isn't so bad. Like his resourcefulness when he doesn't want someone to pick him up, he'll just, you know, turn his face from you. Like, don't pick me up. I don't need to talk. I'm a 1-year-old. Don't pick me up. And I'll see that. Like, that's beautiful, you know, that kind of even recalcitrance in that moment. That's a good thing. That's a beautiful thing. And I see that in you, though it might not be readily evident to the people around us or even to myself when I kind of embody that in more professional moments. All of which is to say, embrace mercy, embrace risk, and get away from the, as Baldwin, I think, would remind us, the kind of myth and danger of safety. Right? And a nation that measures its safety, as he said, in corpses and chains, you know, those things are inextricable from one another. Our obsession with safety and something like the carceral state.
Well, and your image of the barber holding the blade, you know, and taking care to shape something beautiful right on the margin of the real possibility of harm. That's such a powerful image for the kind of politics you're talking about, not least because it's an incredible inversion of one of the darkest and sort of most famous images of slavery in American literature, this scene in Melville's Benito Sereno, where the sort of ostensible slave, but who's actually in charge, is holding that razor up to a man's neck, and everything is playing out in this totally occluded, mysterious way. And you have this image in which finally those relations become completely consensual. And there still is a relationship of, well, not of dominance and subservience, but a relationship of service, you know, and care. But that, and there's still that same danger involved, but now it's mediated through care rather than this funhouse mirror of domination and submission. We have a bunch of audience questions actually that I'd like to bring up to you guys, because some of them are really wonderful. So Richard Falk says, wonderful presentation of truly memorable poetry. Do you think poems can be transformative beyond abolitionism, but in relation to providing peace and justice in the world? So, and I think that question, you know, comes from maybe one part of that question is can we think on an even like more international scale, and can we think about these issues that often get shunted into the realm of nation states and say, well, they have to worry about whether to go to war or not. We worry about what happens inside our countries. Is there a way for us to move from abolition to those questions?
I mean, yeah, like, I don't know if I would use those exact words, because I actually do think that abolition holds a lot of that. Again, it's not necessarily like what people associate it with, but I think that it certainly holds some of that things. Like, for instance, surveillance. I mean, that's as international as it gets. Yeah, it's as international as it gets. But what I will say is, yes, I definitely think that obviously poetry can hold that, music can hold that. I think I think that art holds everything. It just holds everything. There's nothing it can't or doesn't hold. It just depends on what you need in that moment. That's definitely something I've learned. Like, you're talking about spirit. Like, it doesn't just hold the things that are inside of this world. It holds between the worlds. It holds like all of that stuff, So there's nothing that it can't contain.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on what sort of abolitionist you are, because there are some of us, huddled in the corner, where part of what we're really dreaming of is also the abolition of war. Like, part of what we're actually thinking is, and I know, our cousins, the chimpanzees, go to war. So, I mean, it's deep in us, to go to destroy each other. And I think at its most capacious and imaginative, abolition is also just fundamentally about peace and thinking differently about social relations, between the human and non-human world in almost every way you can fathom. It's about, older visions, even in the 19th century, of recently emancipated Black communities where children could vote. I mean, we're trying to think about this stuff along a bunch of different directions. How do poems help us get there? I mean, for me, poetry has always been one about electrifying the language of my everyday life. So I think when my prose kind of falls slack, or even I find myself in everyday conversation just sounding kind of dry, picking up some Clifton or some A.R. Ammons has always done the trick. So that's one thing, right, to just sort of charge your everyday life. But I also think poetry requires a certain measure of patience, because you have to learn how to read it. It's not readily evident how to read any of my favorite poets, people like Christopher Gilbert, Harriet Mullen, Terence Hayes. It took me years to really, Vilius Moss, to really get into what they were maybe up to, and then what that could mean for me. Hours in the library in the dark, poring over this stuff, by the light of my phone as a graduate student. And I'm immensely thankful for it, because that patience has paid dividends. And so part of why I tell people poetry education is important is that that's a human virtue, to be able to sit with something you don't quite understand and meditate on it and return to it, and to say, this is not readily evident to me, but there's a spark of a certain kind of beauty or imagination in it that's magnetic, and I will return. So that's what I think poetry can do for us, socially at least.
Samora, you look like you were gonna throw something in there.
I know. I'm just like, I feel like I'm in church. Like, to everything like that. The one other capacity I think poetry has given me in my life, because I was lucky enough to, even though I wouldn't call myself a poet. Like, I grew up with all poets around me, and my best friends are all poets. Josh was one of my best friends. I first learned of his work through listening to him do his thing, and then we became friends. But I think another one that holds it for me is like the capacity to be self-reflective, which I think is another, like, if we're going to get to anything like a conception of peace, which, holds all things inside of it, because like he said, there's no world in which we can't have any violence at all. But there are certainly worlds where we cannot have war, where we cannot destroy each other and dominate each other on that level. And I think one way is to be self-reflective, to understand what the heck you're really about. Because a lot of people tell themselves that they're about one thing, they're really about another. And that's how they actually end up evading themselves for long enough to do the terrible things they do. You know what I mean? And so I think if you're really doing poetry right, if you're doing music right, you have to be honest. You have to be self-reflective.
The writer Jonathan Schell, in this amazing book, The Unconquerable World, he says this thing about how one of the most unrecognized facts of the 20th century was how many times and in how many places superior force did not actually win the day. And in fact, there's a kind of unwritten history of the 20th century in which, contrary to all the gruesome aspects, violent, bloody aspects of the 20th century, which, not to diminish them in any way, exist, absolutely, but parallel to that is this incredible sequence of events in which huge political transformations, the independence of India, the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the apartheid state in South Africa, were achieved either without violence or, in some cases, there was violence on both sides, but the side that won was the side with vastly fewer soldiers, with vastly fewer weapons, which is to say that there was some other force, some other discipline, some other self-reflective, exercise of the will that was bigger and stronger than airplanes and bombs and tanks and so forth, and that form of organization is actually something that the 20th century has gifted us an incredible repertoire of. And one of the reasons why people in the West just totally failed to see the end of the Soviet Union coming is because the received wisdom here was that you can't bring about a revolution without force, without violence. And here's a totally totalitarian state that has a complete monopoly on violence. So how could anyone ever beat them? How could anyone ever turn around? But in fact, this whole dissident movement, led actually in large part by artists and writers like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, a playwright who became the first president of the Czech Republic, were building a kind of alternative civil society, and that alternative civil society was the thing that undermined this huge monolithic system of force. I want to jump to another question which is related to this. Someone asks, what ways can people help validate the role that the arts and music play in the movement for achieving racial justice when academia and politics often dominate the narrative? And I think that's a question worth taking seriously, that it's like artists really do always are like, we can change the world and we can bring peace, but in fact, there is this like barrier between artists and like serious people that is constantly policed. And so how do we... And artists share some responsibility in the like erecting of that barrier, possibly, possibly. Yes. But how do we think about that?
Good question. Well, I think one is obviously we have to participate in what MLK would call a revolution of values. I mean, like, if we always think that politicians have the answer to our problems, then they're always gonna be able to speak first, and then we're going to end up in the same cycle we always are, because they're just going to make it worse. So I think people need to take seriously that question. I think that is a great question. I think there's kind of an answer inside that question, which is just like that is a part of the revolution of values we need to have, is to actually think about who we actually believe have the ideas. And I'm not even speaking, I'm extending that past artists actually to the conception of the everyday person. Like, I just think that we literally ask all the wrong people for all the answers we need. So that's a revolution of values that has to take place, and just for us to like reorient ourselves with that. And then I think within, and you talking about the artists, like I think one of the tensions that Joshua and I have spoke about often is that just like in every other, reality in a capitalist world, artists exist inside of industry. And as a result, we are very caged by the conceptions, possibilities, and realities of that industry. And I think that that's partly on us to, once again, organize ourselves out of that space, just like everything else. But at the same time, I think what we're seeing right now is that we're very held as an artist community, whatever. I don't know if it's a community, but artists in general are still very held by that space. And as a result, I think, if anything, we've unfortunately seen a receding, at least in the popular sphere, of like artists actually, speaking truth to power in a way that actually threatens capital. They do it when it's real safe, but, so I think those two things are important.
I think we need intellectual and emotional courage and an impetus toward collaboration that's shared. Thinking about this conference from a few months ago, which was basically sort of voices gathered against the first use of nuclear weapons that Elaine Scarry helped organize here. And she sent me an email and asked if I'd be willing to come read some poems at the conference. And I just thought, well, this is quite strange. It's going to be people from Congress there and lawyers. Why would you want me to read poems? And then we just had a conversation about this particular facet of the Black expressive tradition. People like Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez and June Jordan, who'd written extensively in their work, from a kind of anti-nuclear position, and that it actually would be quite meaningful and quite important for me to have a space in that moment to talk about that tradition and then read the work itself. And it just struck me that I'd never really seen anything like that at that sort of gathering. And I thought, well, this could be replicated. We could just do the thing that we're theorizing. We could have space for drummers and pianists and cellists and violinists and spoken word poets and dancers to be at these gatherings where these ostensibly serious ideas, as if the most serious ideas in the world aren't coming forth at a jazz gig or something like that, right? But I guess that's another set of questions. I think those kind of collaborations can just be made real, but you have to be courageous. If you're someone like Elaine, you have to have the idea and say, well, I can implement that. Why not? Why not us and why not now? So that's one thing I would say.
I think another element of that courage, too, is that the other reason people are scared of that is that artists are not easily controllable. And I'm not talking about entertainers. I'm talking about artists.
Yeah,
right.
Because those are two very different things in my mind. But, like a lot of artists are weird. People say you're weird, you're strange. Like, you might not necessarily, if you put an artist in a room like that, you might not necessarily know what they'll do.
Yes.
And that is very exciting. That's part of the point. But I think a lot of people are very scared by that.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing on that point? And this is part of why, to your revolution of values point as well, I just think we need new institutions as well, right? Like I think we have to build spaces in which that is normative practice. Now, whether these are experimental colleges or sort of social justice organizations with very clear particular aims and a certain kind of openness in talking about how capital is raised and how it's dispersed, that's how I think we get to, again, these other kind of visions of freedom. This is the lesson of someone like Carter G. Woodson, right? He was building institutions, like he was crafting these textbooks, but it was through working with unions of Black teachers in the South that those ideas were dispersed and transmitted and traveled internationally. And I think that kind of institutional sensibility can actually be a good thing for us. I don't think institutions are always a bad word, and we need to build new ones that are strong and open.
Yeah, I wonder how we can build confidence in art or artistic creation or the weird people on the margins, prophets and dreamers and so forth, at the same time that we can build institutions, or to go back to a word that you used earlier, community, that community that could say to you, okay, maybe not singing, try something else. That balance, that dialectic between the person who goes out into the forest is something that's a really deep pattern in human history, in human cultures all over the world, that there are people who go out into the forest in order to have some kind of experience, and then they come back to the community and they tell the community about their experience, and then a very delicate negotiation ensues. Like the community is like, what do we take up from this? What do we accept from this? What do we not? And if it works right, I think, then it's neither wholesale rejection nor immediate unquestioning uptake. It's balance. And, it leads me to ask, are there, in a vision of the world where the artists are really taking their place leading these movements, or art is really at the forefront of this, are there dangers to that we have to be on guard against? I'm thinking of, for instance, there was this Italian poet, Gabriele D'Annunzio, who founded a kind of like poet city-state republic after World War I, and it was a disaster. It went very badly, and it became a kind of fascist terror. And like, it's not to say that all poets would do that, but how might we, one way of thinking about, how do we bring artists into a place where they really are taken seriously in the political world is, how do we, what things should we be on the lookout for to make sure that it happens right?
Well, I have two immediate thoughts to that. I hope it's not like an evasion of the question, but One is like I don't think any like one group of people should ever be in charge of anything.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Like
That's fair.
you know, in you know, in the best case scenario, I think, you know, it would be all different type of professions and callings and purposes and things. And I also think, I really hope that we get one day to a place where we see that creativity is everywhere and we call it there, you know, where it is. Like there's creativity in certainly creativity in the barber. Like the barber is an artist, you know, the cook is an artist, you know, this is some of the most beautiful things that, you know, Joshua does in his poetry, is to show how the artistry in all these places, you know, and these processes and professions and callings that different people have, that again usually are relegated to the da-da-da-da-da, like this is not important or this is normal or whatever, but require so much creativity, so much discipline, as you spoke about, so much like, you know, commitment, you know, all these different amazing things. But I think that when a lot of those professions are devalued in our society, people are not made to feel like they're important when they do those things. Yeah. And that's a big problem, you know? So in my like ideal world, I would have those people actually be in charge, and the artists can be a part of that psychological, emotional, spiritual process of it. I think that's really where we are needed. That's the job that, as you said, Baldwin would say only we can do. And I do kind of believe in that. Like when it comes to that in between things, words are not enough type of stuff, or words, we need other words, better word, you know, or like, you know, we have to speak to some complicated truths. That's where the artists come in.
In other words, the artist is really kind of like the meta artist, whose job it is to kind of sanctify the real art and artifice of all the work that makes society go, and to sort of lift that up as the kind of art at the center of human making.
We definitely need a different word, because meta artist sounds very like God. Like that seems too important. That's the opposite of what I want. You know, I'm like meta artist.
No,
yes,
fair
but
enough.
Conceptually,
But the artist,
I agree.
right. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Here's another question that maybe links up with this. This is from Gay Tiernan, and this question is about will as self-determination and a shared vision of peace based on cultural competition and appreciation. And I guess I'm just going to kind of a little bit riff on those terms. So forgive me, Gay, if I'm getting your gist wrong. But is there a way to think about, you know, the plurality of cultures and cultures interacting with each other and having a complex relationship where sometimes they're admiring each other and sometimes they're competing with each other? Like, is it possible for that to become an avenue towards peace rather than towards conflict?
I mean, to me, it would depend on how we're defining culture. This is strange, and maybe because I'm writing a book on spoken word. The first thing that came to mind was like a poetry slam where you have the venue from Denver, Colorado, and another from Fort Lauderdale in New York. And it's a sanctioned competition where all of these different voices are brought to the fore. And yes, someone wins, but them winning is not the triumph of that particular voice in the cultural landscape, right? It's actually just a game. And I think part of what it sounds like we're trying to work out here, and I want to tap back into the last question too, I don't always know how much it's about bringing artists into our current political order as we understand it, so much as protecting them and the institutions they build from co-optation and destruction. So we wrote together earlier this year about the Black Arts Repertory Theater in school.
For sure.
Right? And it's still kind of unclear. Like, what destroyed that place? Was it being infiltrated by the FBI? Not necessarily, right? They went in and said, okay, this is not a hub for socialist activity. We're going to leave now. And then they left. And part of what it sounds like actually happened, at least as it is narrated from the poets who were part of the teaching faculty, was that younger poets came in and they said, you old guys need to go. And then there was a shootout in front of the place and funding dried up, right? But that's quite complicated, right? Because it also has to do with relinquishing our desire for permanence. These organizations, these institutions come and go. And I think that's a very artist way of living in the world, right? Some years the gigs are there, sometimes they're not, right? Sometimes you are the person in your given subfield, and you will be replaced. That is just the way that it needs to go. Political orders, I think, are the same way. It's not meant to be eternal, right? And getting more comfortable with that kind of flow of life and death and shine and shadow, I think that's part of what the artist is here to teach us too, how to relinquish that desire to live forever and instead lose ourselves in the flow of something different. Now, what impact that'll have on our politics or the way we build our societies, I think it waits to be seen, but it's desirable, I think, especially now, you know, in this state of emergency.
The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote about communities in the Amazon who had different political organizations depending on the time of year, whether it was the time to harvest in the village or whether it was time to be out gathering in the forest. And in one side, it was pretty hierarchical, and there was a person in charge, and people sort of submitted to that person. But it only lasted a few months, and then people went out and lived in a much more egalitarian way when they were out gathering and hunting in the forest at a certain moment. And so the lesson there is that it's possible to envision a more flexible situation, and it's not a situation of no order or of anarchy exactly. It's a situation in which you can come and go out of different orders and not be paralyzed by it. And I think it relates to this Black resistance to the nuclear injustice that you were bringing up, Joshua, which is that, you know, the advent of nuclear weapons was the beginning of these huge, intractable technological structures all around us that were designed to keep the world in a like exact stalemate, right? It was all the balance of terror, the balance of power. I mean, and so many institutions are modeled, actually, I think, on that surround us now are modeled on that nuclear stalemate, where the whole thing is, you know, this is set up in such a way that you can't change, because if you change, if you try to mess with this, then boom, we all blow to pieces. So, so I think imagining forms of flexibility, relearning the flexibility that modernity, for all of its supposed like, you know, change and progress or whatever, has totally lost. Like, I think that would be, that's a thing that art could set itself to do. We should start to wrap up, and I want to just read one last little comment here that's come in. Beverly Keever just says, besides posting the recording online, and for those of you who are joining us now, or who joined us later, the recording will be posted online very soon. Could you also post the words you, the poet, spoke, and perhaps also the words to the songs, because there was so much profound information, we need to be able to absorb it, perhaps over time. And Beverly, we'll do our best to get things online for you. But thank you so much for such a generous assessment of the evening, and I couldn't agree more. This was an amazing event, and it's just an honor and a privilege to share this stage with you two gentlemen. Thank you very much. We're gonna close out here. I don't know, Samora, if I can ask you for like a little outro music, but
I'm sure I can come with something. What are we gonna do?
Yeah.
What are we gonna do?
Before you do that, let me just say thank you all again for being with us. This is a webinar of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. You can find out more about us and our work at wagingpeace.org, and we hope you sign up for our mailing list and keep updated on future events. And you can also find Joshua Bennett and Samora Pinderhughes online and follow their amazing work over the coming months and years and decades.